Mr. Chairman, your discussion here is an extremely important one. And it seems to me the solution lies with us. OMB has done its thing, and that's fine. They can suggest, but we're the ones that are actually going to write the appropriation as well as the budgets. And you and I have, for the first time, I think, in a long, long time, you and I also sit on the Sea Power Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. And as members of that committee, I think we have an opportunity here to achieve what you said in your last couple of sentences, and that is to work with the Department of Defense budget so that some portion of that plus-up, that additional money, is available to meet the needs of the Coast Guard, the national security issues of the Coast Guard, not degrading in any way the national security issues dealing with drug interdiction. But also you are deeply engaged in what we might call specific defense issues in the Persian Gulf, for example, and other places. So I think we have an opportunity in that, in our role on the House Armed Services Committee, to see that there's a certain level of funding, if it's $54 billion or whatever the additional funding is, that it becomes available to the Coast Guard for a couple of things, and they're on my mind, that the men and women of the Coast Guard have the same benefit package that the men and women of the Department of Defense have, so that those needs, and that's housing and all of the rest of it. Secondly, that there is money for the ongoing development of the icebreakers, not one, but 3 that we need to build in order to meet the needs that we've talked about so many times in the Arctic, so that we set in place in that Department of Defense, National Defense Authorization Act, and in the appropriations, the money necessary to carry that out, and the other, and to provide specific money for those things that are specific for national, the military side of national defense, so that we can parcel out of the budget, whether it's 4% or 5 or 10 or 15% of your budget, say, okay, here's the OCO funding that you're doing in the Persian Gulf, or wherever else that might be. So I think we have the opportunity, perhaps unique at this particular period of time, because, Mr. Chairman, you and I are on that Sea Power Subcommittee, and we already have a relationship with the Navy with regard to the Coast Guard. I've asked for some specific information, Mr. Commandant, for the scheduling of the money necessary to carry out the Coast Guard program, year 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And I want to collapse it into 3 years. You can do it, right? If you have the money.
Big if. Yes, sir, I'm all in.
We understand the difficulties there. I want to move to what is, I guess, my, I don't know, it's becoming an obsession. How to build ships in the United States. I mean, ocean-going ships. So, Mr. Zavat, if we could, I want to go through a series of questions with you. You've already spoken to the 78 vessels and probably going down. Has MARAD conducted a formal analysis of the needs and shortfalls it sees in the military sea lift for both ships and seafarers?
Congressman, yes, we have.
Can you broadly describe it, what it is that what your analysis is?
Yes, sir. So as just building off of my testimony, and thank you for raising this, because from our perspective, this is the single biggest issue that the Maritime Administration and our counterparts in sea lift and military side are facing. So we've identified a shortfall, as I said, of about 2,000 mariners, of qualified available mariners in the commercial sector, which equates to, roughly speaking, a shortfall of about 45 vessels sailing under the U.S. flag fleet. If we continue to rely, as our policy has been and as it makes sense to have a policy to do, to rely on the U.S. flag fleet to provide those mariners. So the first answer to your question, sir, is yes, we've done the analysis, we've identified the shortfall, and we've identified how many vessels would have to be employed, would have to be added to eliminate that shortfall. Yes. That, however, does not address a point that Chairman Hunter had made. We're doing this all under the sea lift requirements that are established by the Department of Defense. And those requirements, as the chairman mentioned, at the moment leave off two things. One is that they assume that all vessels would be available 100% of the time if they're sailing commercially or activated in wartime. And we know that even in peacetime, no vessel is available 100% of the time. There's downtime, there's scheduled maintenance, and there's some percentage of breakdowns. But the other important issue that the chairman identified for going forward for the next war plan is that up until this point, really since the end of World War II, we've always been able to assume no attrition with the merchant marine in our future conflicts, which is a bloodless way of saying that we've been able to assume that we would never have ships torpedoed or bombed or destroyed by missiles, and we would not have civilian merchant mariners killed.
Move along here because we're
Yes, sir.
getting near the end of all of this. Can you provide us with both of those scenarios? That is, a peacetime scenario of what our needs are, and then a wartime scenario?
Sir, I cannot provide you with the wartime scenario until we get that from the Department of Defense. I can certainly provide you with the information on the current scenarios that we plan for.
Very good. I would appreciate it if you could do that. As you know, I've introduced a bill, H.R. 1240, which would expand the U.S. flag fleet by requiring a percentage of U.S. crude oil and LNG on American flag vessels. We've talked to you about this. Would this make a difference?
Congressman, yes, it would.
How and why?
So the Government Accountability Office indicated that looking at your proposal, that by around 2025, it would be adding about 100 ships sailing under the U.S. flag for exporting LNG. If I recall correctly, your proposal would be for 30% of that to be sailing on U.S. flag. So that would add the equivalent of 30 vessels to the U.S. flag fleet, which is a huge cut into our deficit of about 45 vessels that we have
Is that
today.
for the LNG?
That is just for the LNG side.
Crude oil, have you done an analysis of what it would mean for crude oil?
A crude analysis, if you will, Congressman.
Very good. I'll accept that.
So currently, we export the equivalent of about one large tanker a day of crude oil. And the challenge here is projecting with the volatility of prices. But if you assume that that stays roughly equal, you're looking at another 30 or so vessels being employed a year if they were all U.S. flag. So again, 30% of that is another 9 or 10 vessels that would be added to the U.S. flag
So
fleet.
how many, once again, for LNG
For LNG, you're looking at 30.
and crude?
And again, a crude estimate for crude is about another 10 as things stand today.
Another
10,
10.
yeah.
All right, so some 40 ships
Yes.
that could be built if we were to pursue such a policy.
That's what the numbers would say, yes, Congressman.
We heard from Mr. Curry the issue of bilateral negotiations. I think he mentioned China as an example of a bilateral negotiation. They are set to require that all of the importation of LNG and oil be on Chinese ships. Some of that may be American crude oil and American LNG. I suppose since the President's so intent on bilateral negotiations, and he's such a good deal maker, maybe it could be done. I think we've covered it here. You did talk about adding sailors with regard on the military budget, so that's already covered here. I think we've covered those particular issues. The ready reserve capitalization. General McDew said that he would look for ships that are in the worldwide fleet that might be able to replace the ready reserve. Would those be American-built ships?
The ships in the worldwide fleet, Congressman, no, sir. And the challenge with that is just the ships that we have that were built in American shipyards. I think the youngest ship that we have that's sailing currently under foreign flags is about 34 years old. So to General McDew's testimony, as I've heard him talk about, is a mix of having some new builds in U.S. shipyards, coupled with purchasing foreign-built vessels that would, much younger vessels than the average age of our ready reserve force, our surge fleet ships today, which are nearly 40 years old. And I think just to underscore General McDew's point, there has never been a time like there is today in terms of if you want to purchase ships in the international market on the cheap, now is the time to do that. There's a huge surplus of those vessels right now.
We would be purchasing foreign-made ships for a tradition of American-built ships in the ready reserve. I think it's no more than is it also the law?
So Congressman, yes and no. Yes in the sense that we would be building foreign flag ships, and yes in the sense that the law currently requires us to have them built in U.S. shipyards. No in the sense that the vast majority of the ships that we have in the Ready Reserve Force today were not built in U.S. shipyards. They were brought on board under exceptions or before the law was put in place.
So exception by exception and ship by ship not built in the United States.
So again, I don't want to speak for General McDew, but from what I've heard from his testimony, he's looking for a cost-effective mix, recognizing that it's hard to build any proposal to replace, to recapitalize all 61 ships we have in the surge fleet. MSC has 15, we have 46. It would be hard to justify for new construction for all 61 of those vessels, especially since all of those vessels, once built, would be going into reserve and would not be going into any sailing service. So I believe, again, his proposal or his vision is to have that mix of having a good mix of vessels that are built in U.S. shipyards, as well as vessels that could be purchased inexpensively overseas to recapitalize the fleet. One way or the other, the fleet does need to be recapitalized.
Well, I, for one, await his strategy, and I'd appreciate your analysis of his strategy and what it means for lost jobs in American shipyards. Apparently, it would not mean for lost sailors on the ship or mariners on the ship, but it would be a problem. Mr. Chairman, you've already dealt with the issue of the Maritime Academy ships, which is an ongoing issue that we have, so I won't go to that. The training vessels. We've heard about the small shipyard grant program. I will say that I was pleased to see how well it operated in the Bollinger Yard as well as in the one of the other yards. So with that, I think I've covered it. There may be some additional questions that I'd like to put for the record at some time. And I thank Chief, Admiral, Mr. Sabat. Thank you so much.
Thank the